Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to Table Talk for the Asian American community. My name is Andy Engel. I'm the senior programmer at Reimagine, and I'm honored to welcome you all. When we created Table Talk last fall as part of Reimagine's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative, also known as JEDI, we sought to create an honest and lively and unscripted conversation where Black, Indigenous, Latinx, AAPI, LGBTQ+, and other underrepresented groups could share their unique experiences vis-a-vis living and dying well in their respective communities. Although created by and for these communities, everyone is welcome at the table. So again, thanks for joining us. I want to thank the John and Wowna Harmon Foundation for their support of Reimagine and our JEDI initiative, which makes Table Talk possible. And now I want to hand this over to Holly Chan and Elizabeth Wong, our fearless captains of the AAPI Table Talk series. You guys are awesome. Take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Chan. I'm one of the organizers for the Asian American Pacific Islander Table Talks here at Reimagine. And I'm actually a volunteer for Reimagine. In my day-to-day work, I'm a user experience designer in aerospace, but I've been extremely passionate about not just working on the space with AAPI folks, but before that in general, making sure that end-of-life care and death care is more accessible financially, environmentally, and humanely to all people. So this year, we wanted to make sure to focus on AAPI folks because we realized there was a need to address the specific needs for AAPI folks in this, not industry, but in this subject matter. And we have different thoughts about how our culture is coming to terms with grief, especially during this time. Since most of us are calling in from around the United States, please join us in acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of multitudes of Indigenous peoples, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. This land acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism. As a resident of Seattle myself, I'm located on Coast Salish, Duwamish, Still-Guamish, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish land. If you're curious about the Indigenous territory where you're located, check out the link that I'm about to post in the chat. Or someone will post in the chat. Let's also remember today and hold in our heart those who have been assaulted or murdered out of ignorance and hatred. Most recently, Makia Bryant, Patco, Angela Quinto, Bichar Tanapakdi, Christian Hall, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, and really just far, far too many others. If there's someone that you would like to remember, please post her name in the chat as well. I'm going to hand it off to Elizabeth, who is my co-creator and will be helping us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us. While this is sort of our last table talk of this series, or actually for this series, we will have more programming coming up in the next coming months. So please follow us. Today, I want to create the intention for this table talk, and it's been the theme through all of our table talk events. Our goal is to hold space for those who identify as Asian American. When we say hold space, we found this quote from end-of-life doula Francesca Lynn Arnoldi to be useful to describe what we mean. We find abundant spaciousness within this space we hold. There's room for it all: joy and sorrow, laughter and tears, wonderment and worry. We invite any of it in and let it be present, watching shifts and changes emerge. Things don't need to be a certain way. Humans are complicated beings capable of a complicated array of emotion. Francesca Lynn Arnoldi. Just like how there is no one right way to live life or grieve, there is no one right way to be an Asian American. Let's also recognize that the experiences within the Asian American community can greatly vary depending on region, color of skin, religion, immigration status, and so forth. Let's use our short time together to listen to one another's perspectives such that we can help guide ourselves, families, and our larger communities.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guests at today's table. First off is Sarah Mack. She's been a close friend of mine, and she has also been an educator in China over the past few years. Most recently, during the pandemic, she relocated back to the United States, and I'm so happy to have her here at the table to help me facilitate this conversation. Next is Jessica Rothwell. She's a bioarchaeology PhD candidate who's been exploring the anthropology of life and death throughout history and is able to also share what that means in her own life. We also have Aisha Fukushima. She's a acclaimed performance lecturer, justice strategist, singer, songwriter, and a raptivist, and founder of Raptivism. And then finally, we have Crystal Chan. She's a children's novelist, a speaker, and a social and spiritual activist. So starting with Sarah and then going around the table, go ahead and give yourselves a larger introduction, including what table are you sitting at today, emotionally, spiritually. This is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, which I know has a lot of feelings, a lot of joy, a lot of sorrow. Where are you at today, Sarah?
Thanks, Holly, for that lovely introduction. Physically, I'm also at a table with a lot of clutter on it, and maybe that's a good, I guess like a good image to also describe my life right now. Or I guess it's a table that's slowly getting decluttered because I guess for the past year or so, and I'm sure that many of you can relate in different ways, it seems that the general theme has been a de-stripping of things for me. So like Holly mentioned, I was in China for several years teaching English, working with college students, and that all changed in the beginning of last year. And I relocated back to Washington State and have since moved to the southwest of the US for a short-term stay. And I'm in a current period of wondering what is next and finding that a lot of the things that I thought I needed to hold on to are actually impermanent. So that has been quite the journey. And I think too, just kind of figuring out who am I in this space as a mixed race person, as someone who is Asian American, but also as someone who, also has a Caucasian background, and figuring out what that looks like in 2021 with just the amount of pain and suffering that is going on with so many people groups on the margins. So, and I'm wanting to incorporate that and to engage more with suffering in my next job. So that's a little bit about me. I guess it's still kind of abstract, but that's where I'm at currently.
Thank you, Sarah. Jessica, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am calling in today from Tempe, Arizona, which is the ancestral land of the Oaxaca Pipash and their ancestors. And as a bioarchaeologist, I spend a lot of time thinking about identity and mortuary practice in an archaeological context. My dissertation research actually focuses on ancient Greece, but I'm really excited today to kind of engage with my own identities, my own experiences with grief and loss, and kind of take that anthropological perspective and bring that to this discussion today. I'm just really excited to be here and part of this opportunity today. So.
Thank you, Jessica. And Crystal, do you want to go ahead and go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Crystal Chan. My Cantonese Chinese name is Mei Sun, so Mei Sun Chan. I'm here in Chicago, Potawatomi area, and I am a children's novelist, and I use my English name for my my children's authorship, my secular social justice activism, which I do a lot social media wise, especially on Facebook and elsewhere. And then under my Chinese name, Mei Sun, I've been doing more and more with spiritual activism and spiritual companionship, most recently helping individuals kind of find and identify their spiritual fingerprint. Like, what does that mean? And how do you claim that? And how do you find joy in that? For where I'm at right now, I guess I would say just I'm in a season of claiming my fusion. And I would love to talk more about that, in our conversation and how that's working for me and how I'm just like, I don't know about you all, but like 2020 and ongoing, obviously it's still going on. So many things. I'm just done, I'm just done. And I've been drawing lines and boundaries like I never have before and coming into a certain type of self-definition because of those lines and boundaries that I've never felt before, and also in a racialized sense too. So I'm really happy to kind of explore a little bit of that. And I'm also really happy to see I've been kind of like going through the faces of folks here in the audience. And if there's one thing that I find makes me feel really like claustrophobic, it's homogeneous spaces of whatever homogeneity. And so like to have like just this really diverse set of faces and names and skin tones and nose shapes and like all sorts of things, like it just hair, it makes me really delighted to be here. So thank you.
So glad to have you, Crystal. And last but not least, Aisha, come on up to the stage.
Hey everyone, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I just want to say thank you again to all of the organizing that went into this. And Holly, thank you for reaching out and just really connecting all the dots, at least from my journey experience to this very moment. I'm super grateful for that. My name is Aisha Fukushima. As you can see by the naming on the bottom of the screen, I go by she, her pronouns mostly. And I'm here on occupied Lenape territory by way of what many people know as Philadelphia, but also have roots in occupied Duwamish territories. I heard a lot of Washington State love out there. So yes, to all of the things, and also roots in Yokohama, Japan. And I think about folks like the Ainu or the Ryukyu and what is by many people known as Okinawa. So just want to kind of shout out the locality of not only those acknowledgements, but as Holly, you put it just so clearly, that this is also about how do we create decolonization and liberation ahead. At least that's part of my mission statement. And I could hear that already resonating so much in so much of what has been said. I call myself a justice strategist, or kind of have been dubbed that by a lot of my friends, in that I do a lot of arts and culture. I sing, I create freedom songs, I make beats and do keynotes and all of these types of things, facilitation. A lot of my skills have been honed as an educator in the classroom, both in public schools to Ivy League schools to community colleges and all of the things. They're all connected. They're all, everywhere and in between. And that's both in the United States and around the world. Some of my work with Raftivism and starting that global hip hop justice project has been like a way of finding how to create different kinds of pedagogy and praxis that could connect dots across a lot of different places and spaces without like also questioning kind of certain kinds of imperialized or kind of imperial and empire-centric learning modes, and kind of retooling, creating new ways of being with one another and creating space with one another. So I say that because I think that plays into the music that I create. It plays into the speeches that I do, and it plays into the collaboration and the attempt to play with the tempo of the everyday. So I hope that tells you a little bit about what table I'm sitting at. I'm super grateful to be here, and I want to make sure we have time for all the questions. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I'm so glad you could join us today. And if you tuned in earlier, that was Aisha's music that we had playing at the very beginning. So be sure to look her up after this. So to kind of open up the conversation, we're going to start with something that simultaneously goes really deep and really broad and could potentially mean nothing at all. It depends on how you interpret it. But what does home mean for you? And then we'll just go from there. So whoever wants to start can go ahead and riff off of that. You can definitely take a minute to think about it too. And I love for the audience to also reflect on this question and share in the chat if you have any thoughts about what home means for you.
I'll take a first shot at it. I usually call it a first draft thought, right? Home has always been a tricky place. I grew up mixed race in a smallish town in Wisconsin, very white in the 80s and 90s. And so home is at the like at the one on the one hand, like the nature and the outdoors like is something that's just like sunk deep in my soul. It's like left like a forever imprint, right? Indelible. And on the other hand, like a place of like absolute belonging, like belonging to the earth and the sunsets and the sunrises and the sky, you know, and the birds and the hawks that fly above you. And home, as I experienced, was like a really deep place of exclusion. On the other hand, and then in between, like the inclusion, the exclusion, there's all of this like liminal space of like sometimes I'm accepted and sometimes I'm not accepted, you know. So it's a very complicated concept for me, and I know that as I've aged, I've especially in my 20s and early 30s, I was really intensely looking for belonging, like on a deep belonging, because I felt such deep like ambiguity about belonging at home, like even within the home, you know, being biracial. So it's always been this place, and in the last couple of years, the concept of home for me has gone on a deeper level of again, like the sense of the elements for me have really come into play. So like I always have the earth within me, and I always have water within me, and I always have air within me, and like in that very elemental home. And I think also like on a spiritual level for me, just like being really grounded in place and time and spirit, for me is becoming more and more important. Also, it's been interesting over the pandemic where I've been increasingly in like mixed race spaces and AAPI spaces in a way that I was never able to do in like the old world, just because of physical difficulties. And so like the fact that like almost every week I'm in a group of kind of my own, you know, is like a really deep kind of satisfaction of this longing. And of course it's virtual, so it's not a total satisfaction, but like it's kind of revolutionized my world of like where home is, you know, like where is home if home is on a Zoom box, right? Like that's weird. And so it's kind of like mind expanding and challenging at the same time.
You know, that is interesting because I made this reflection only recently. Well, I think I was texting with Liz, and I don't think I shared it with you, Liz, but I haven't spent this much time in a room with other Asian American women as I have during the pandemic. And that's just during Zoom calls, you know, during these table talk events or similar events put on by our friends and connections. And it's crazy to think that's been missing from my life because it felt so natural. How would anyone else like to share about where are there moments where you found home, even if you don't have a definition for home? Where's the moment where you felt at home in your heart?
I think for me, especially as I've gotten older, home has become less of a place and more of a concept. And I feel most at home when I'm with people that I feel like support me, and I don't feel like I have to, you know, put in extra work just to exist, just to communicate with people on the same level. And so, I mean, I could identify multiple places and people as home. And I think kind of reflecting on that conceptual home rather than a physicality of place place can be part of that concept of home. I think it really speaks to this human need to connect with other people and to feel heard and included and part of a community. And there's so many times, especially as somebody of mixed race, feeling kind of out of place. Like you're always part of one thing, but not all the way part of one thing and feeling that kind of tug in different directions. And also for me, I'm half Filipina, half white, but for a lot of people who don't know me, I look very ambiguous. So like this also kind of societal level of identity formation where people kind of make assumptions when they look at you and how they include you in their communities. And so yeah, it's for me, home is this kind of concept of finding your people, not necessarily a specific place to go back to necessarily, but people you can always lean on.
Yeah, I super resonate with that. When Crystal was sharing earlier about, just like looking in the Zoom room and seeing the amount of diversity, I was like, wow, that's a space that I really feel at home in, actually. Like, I remember in college, like going to an Asian American Christian fellowship of really sweet people, like all so amazing, but feeling so out of place actually, because I was like one out of two people who were not fully Asian. And I felt like I really didn't belong there. But then I also lived at like a Christian house that was predominantly white. And I also felt like just my Asianness was being spotlit all the time, and like jokes and things like that. But at the end of my freshman year, I started getting involved with international student groups, and I had such a ball. That was like one of the most fun communities I was ever a part of. Everyone was so different, and like no two people were alike in their experiences, like or in their appearances. And there's just this understood belief that we were always going to like be learning from each other, and all of us had something to offer. Um, and I think that's been super important in like the communities that I've found home in, is like there's a sense of like deep, profound respect, and also of like wanting to leave assumptions at the door, I think. Um, and yeah, I think that's like I have individuals who, yeah, like I also feel super at home with, or like families or couples that I'm like third wheeling that I really enjoy. But yeah, also in terms of communities, I've just found that like really important. And I lived in Europe for a little bit, and I've lived in China, and I feel like in some ways like my heart is left behind in each place that I go to. Um, but yeah, there's always a little, just because like I've lived there and I've loved living there, like there still can be that displacement. But in those particular communities, like one that I did find in China and then in college, I've just really felt complete safety in, and belonging. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah.
Wow, there's both in this conversation so far and via the chat. Folks are like just dropping knowledge. So I feel like I'm just soaking it up on all there's like the ones and twos, and I'm just going back and forth between the records, so to speak. This is incredible. I the first word that comes to mind when you ask that question about home is practice. The word practice came to mind. And I think, Crystal, what you were saying about home, is it, I'll put it in my own words, is it a place of comfort? Is it a place of discomfort? Like all the things. And when I look and think about my relationship, for example, with the United States, like United States is home, and I also don't always feel at home here. And writers and, all sorts of incredible expressive voices from James Baldwin and beyond, Grace Lee Boggs could talk about, how they both feel at home and maybe not at home. So I think for me, I think my intuitive understanding or sense of home is that it's both. It can be both. It can be both kind of complex in the sense it has that comfort, it has some of that discomfort or lack of belonging. It also has some challenge. Someone wrote in the chat that home is in their body. And I was also thinking about how sometimes people can feel at home in their body and also not feel at home in their body. pending all the things that are going on, you know? And so then I started to think about this word practice too, right? Like, what is a practice? Why does practice come to mind when I think of home? And I think about even my vocal practice that makes me feel at home in my body, but there's challenge there. It's pushing me out of my comfort zone. It's training me to see how I can play with my breath to make different sounds and feel supported, or make something sound not supported, you know, just have dynamics. And I feel like that's a good metaphor to sort of how I often feel that I'm moving through the world. And when I think about feeling quote unquote at home, I think about a lot of places that held that kind of complexity, whether that's through the metaphor of singing or what I was describing before with kind of the national identities, or however you want to, you know, lingo you want to use to define that. I think about classrooms. I think about theater rehearsals. I think about band practice. I think about, you know, all these different kinds of, you can call them rituals, practices coming together. We're like, we're here, and we know not every school day that I taught was smooth or easy for everyone in the room or anyone in the room sometimes, you know, and that was like, but we were there. We showed up. And so I think, to me, some of all of that is part of what home is. One last thing that pops into my mind on this question is, I remember as when I was growing up as a young person, especially kind of the very early age, my parents, we would kind of go back and forth between Yokohama, Japan, and Seattle, Washington. And every time I would get to, and kind of everywhere in between, because they were working in the music industry at that time. And so I remember that every time I would get to an airport, I'd be like, I'm home, you know? It's like this place of transition. I'm like, yes, this is my spot. I saw someone else in an airport via the chat, so resonating with that. But if that's any clue into kind of what feels like home for me, yeah.
Amazing, thank you. And I never really thought of the idea that a liminal space like an airport could actually feel so at home, but I definitely have felt moments of that when I've gone for airports. Not all the time, especially not in security, but when, I don't know, I landed in Hong Kong for the first time, and then all I have to do is just like scan my ID card and go right through. Hong Kong is definitely like not a totally familiar place to me, but it is a place where I can finally feel like, oh yes, my people, or like my weird Hong Konger people that aren't quite Chinese, not quite anything else. Well, we've kind of brushed upon this, but I'd love to know if any of you have any stories about times where you felt either joy or sorrow with your identity, whatever that might be.
Not to be glib, but I would say like always yes. Always yes. It's always, I've been learning better how to hold the tension, and how to also recognize that the tension doesn't come from me. The tension comes from the world around me telling me I need to fit in a box. And so like putting that responsibility and putting like the source of that tension where it really belongs, which is not like nothing wrong with me, right? And so but still it's still kind of like claiming my intrinsic worth and value and legitimacy. That's always a big thing. Legitimacy, but also realizing that this is really because of our racialized conditioning of like what boxes we're supposed to fit into. And I've found that being mixed, growing up in Wisconsin in the 80s and 90s, like it's really taught me that I didn't have the resources that I needed to fully navigate my world. I did not get any racial identity formation from either of my parents, that kind of a thing. I didn't even hear of the word biracial until I was studying in France when I was 20. That was the first time when I saw someone who physically looked like me. And so it's just like the realization that like the world doesn't have what I need. It will not give me the tools that I need. Even if it had, they don't exist yet, and so like I need to make the tools because they don't exist. Like I can't expect my elders to give them to me because they don't have them either. And so there's a certain type of a loneliness. I'm just like, I have to keep building this stuff, like some of like my novels feature mixed race protagonists because I didn't have mixed race anything growing up. Like I didn't have one book, of a mixed race person anywhere. And they're always like, well, write the book you want to read as a child if you're writing for children. And it's like, well, clearly, I have to write it because it doesn't exist. And so there's this all of that, like the joys and the sorrows, and yet at the same time, because of that, it's really propelled me into being a creative, and creating spaces, creating virtual spaces, creating books, creating spoken word meditations, creating this, creating that, and it's like, so not waiting, and I'm not waiting anymore for that somebody to give me legitimacy, because in this racialized world, no one's going to give me legitimacy, right? I don't fit into a box, right? And so it's kind of like, where does that legitimacy have to come from in order for me to stand in any sort of like intrinsic power? And that's like, it has to come from within. So, and yet it's so sad because it's like, dang, this takes energy. It can be really lonely and hard and intensely rewarding as well. So yeah, it's like always, all the time. Yes, no, yes.
Crystal, everything that you said resonated with me on so many levels. I think not only in a racialized sense, but in the sense that I'm the first person in my family to pursue a PhD. And this kind of feeling of joy but also kind of somewhat not belonging within an academic space. Academia, while increasingly diverse, is still very white. They don't call it an ivory tower for no reason. And there's a lot of times, especially when you get to the level of PhD, where like there's just this unspoken kind of language that you're expected to know, this unspoken knowledge of how you're supposed to navigate the academic space, that if you don't find the right mentors, that if you don't find the right support network, then you're just, you've got to create that space for yourself. Like there's simple things that seem simple to me now that I am I'm an educator. I TA a lot of undergrad courses, and I always tell them, like, talk to your mentors, even if you feel like you're being successful in the class. I didn't know that when I was an undergrad. I had to learn that later by blindly following what other students were doing. And nobody gives you a handbook on how to navigate academia or navigate life, especially when you're feeling like you're in this space of in-betweenness. And, in navigating that space, I've been grateful to find community with other students who are kind of in the same space, who are first generation graduate students who come from backgrounds where maybe even their parents didn't go to college, or like, you're told when you're younger, just do good in school and things will fall where they may, which is kind of the experience I had, and like trying to navigate that space it's been complicated, and it's complicated on an extra level by being in a space where, I mean, there's other people in my department who are people of color or mixed race, but like they don't look like me necessarily. They don't have the same backgrounds, and we can relate on so many different levels, but it's hard to find that space, like spaces like this, where you can find people who can kind of relate with you and help you build that space to be in, because the world outside isn't going to build it for you, like Crystal said.
I'm losing track of the question, but that's good because I'm gonna just riff with it.
It kind of just evolves over time.
Yes,
it's like a game of telephone.
Just wanted to be transparent on that point because we're journeying here. So, yeah, I think part of what came to heart and mind is in the beginning of the conversation, a lot of folks, or it was brought up like being in more spaces like this one, and especially with focus on what. I don't want to say API because the PI is often not always as included as I think it could and should be. but I think for me, it's kind of rare for me to be in spaces like this without volunteering myself or saying, hey, I should be included too. And so I think that's something that I hold in the balance, amidst I kind of agreeing and resonating with all of what's been said, that often I feel in this moment both fully seen, like hyper, perceived on a national scale, whether that's by way of the Naomi Osaka kind of version or I can go down a whole list. Some people might count Kamala Harris, some might not. It's like there are all these different kinds of that kind of lifts up a lot of assumptions that we might have. I think for me also thinking about the history of the one drop rule in the United States and how that plays into who gets called, who doesn't, and how the politics, I don't even use the term, to be quite honest, mixed race, because I fear that a lot of times when people use the term race, and including especially towards me, I've heard all sorts of things. People will say, oh, you're a mutt, things like that, where it's like, that's part of the tapestry of my experience. And that's based, my humble studies would say that that's based in an essentialized kind of way of looking at race, that you might say that one might say that they think it's constructed, but then all the things that follow don't necessarily illustrate, or maybe there's some cognitive dissonance in how we hold and move with those words. And so I just name that because I think that plays such a huge role, and I'm seeing how clearly that plays into some of the politics of today, at least through my humble lens, and also how I feel both super seen and unseen during times like these, if that makes sense. Super present. All of a sudden, I'm getting all these calls that I'd never received before from all these different groups, and then also not seen or not to be included. And I think that's kind of part of. I think, Crystal, I feel like you said part of this, and it's kind of just been throughout the conversation, is also carving out that practice of home, that practice of liberation. One that is not only cognitive, but one that is embodied too. And so for me, the freedom songs and even the facilitation techniques are really, to me, part of, I think Fred Hampton said a quote of something like, just as we don't fight fire with water, or fight fire with fire, we fight fire with water. And we don't fight racism with more racism, we fight racism with solidarity. And so I'm thinking about ways of building solidarity in critical ways, hopefully that can also shift political systems, policy, socioeconomic pieces that are part and parcel to the inequalities that I think are part of some of my lived experience, and I think a lot of America and the whole, globe, around the globe, when we look at inequality, ranging from vaccines to money to all the other things that are connected. Yeah, I could keep going, but I'll pause there. Excuse me.
Oh, we'll keep going with that. Thank you. Sarah, I saw that you were about to say something earlier. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, actually, it's good because I got to hear what Aisha had to say, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so good. And it actually helped me think a little more about, I think my answer, just kind of, hearing how the convo is flowing. And I love that, Aisha, that you said it's about lifting each other up and a lot more about solidarity, because I think growing up, I was just constantly comparing myself. And I think, when you grow up mixed race, and I think particularly being part Asian, there's a sense of not enoughness, or you didn't, no matter what you do, you're never gonna be enough to fully qualify. So I didn't grow up speaking Cantonese at home. I didn't grow up speaking Vietnamese at home. My dad grew up in Vietnam, and I was always left out of those conversations at home when everyone is talking in Canto, and they're talking about you because they'll say your name and then they'll just keep talking. And then you're okay, so probably something was said about me and I have no idea what it is. And I'm just sitting here watching Pokemon with my brother, and we both can't understand. And I think even recently, a couple years ago, I met a girl who had almost the same experience, but not quite the same experience as me. But we were finally, I was oh, I've met someone that almost aligns with my story. And it's been so long since I've met anyone like that. But then I noticed like she was like learning. I think I felt like, oh, she knows more about the food than I do, and how that was like hard for me to accept. Like, oh no, like I've like failed. And I felt so sad about it. Like, oh no, I'm like not doing a good enough job. And I just really want to reject that that mindset that I think like Crystal said, it is like it has to come from within, and it can be, I think, such a lonely road to travel when you're like, my story is like so different from others, and it kind of like alienates me from my family, like even the people who are supposed to be the closest to me, or like from my friends who are this, that, or the other thing. But like also, I think it is like such a powerful tool to, yeah, be like, yes, this is lonely. But also I think I can like still see my worth and still see my value and like call that out in other people when they feel the same way. Yeah, and so I don't know. I think that I don't know if that like totally is a excellent response to like the conversation that has been going on, but that just like struck me as like I think that there's just been such an it's so easy to like box yourself or to like cut you off from other people. But actually I think that that's not the call that we need right now. So I don't know, just something that I was thinking about.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jess.
Everything you just said, Sarah, I just connected with on a really deep level. I don't speak Tagalog, and I didn't learn until I was an adult that the reason why my mom stopped teaching me is because my dad had told her to not teach me Tagalog because he wouldn't be able to understand us. And now it just, I mean, it's been, and I'll hang out with my family. All of my cousins speak Tagalog. All of them have both Filipino parents. And like, I'll go to family gatherings and they'll all be speaking with each other. And it's hard. It's hard because they'll have to like switch to English to speak to me. And, when you're older, it's hard to learn a new language. It's hard to carve out that time. And it's something I've wanted to do, but, life kind of pulls you in different directions, and that kind of feeling apart. Even though you're still part of that family, but feeling that kind of loss of connection with that with your kind of ancestry. And I think specifically for me, especially when I think about the colonial history of the Philippines and kind of what that means in terms of this loss of identity over time, or this kind of reforging of new identities over time. And it's painful to think about, honestly. And like I know, like, I mean, my family still loves me for what I am, but I've always felt kind of apart in that way, and it's something I've struggled with for a really long time. And kind of thinking about that manifestation of a kind of colonial ideas within kind of my own life experience. I also resonated with Aisha was saying about this kind of idea of racial essentialism and like the problems with it. And as an anthropologist, that's something that I grapple with every day. That's something that as an anthropologist, and as any anthropologist, is ethically responsible for. Acknowledging the history of anthropology and how it contributed to concepts of race in the United States and abroad, and dismantling that through acknowledgement and kind of disentangling it and standing up for people who have been hurt by that. And the American Association for Physical Anthropologists has put out multiple statements on race to address this, but it's still something that we have to talk about every day. Race is not a biological construct, it is a social construct, but that does not mean that it doesn't have a biological impact on people. There are people who, because of their race, because of their identity, because of this kind of social construct around them. They've experienced grief, they've experienced loss, they've experienced inequality that directly impacts their health. And I don't know, as somebody with my background, with my life experiences, it's something that I'm constantly kind of nagging at the back of my mind, something that I'm constantly thinking about. And it's something I feel really responsible for, sitting in this academic space. Like, I have a responsibility to do better than people did before me. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like going on this like weird tangent, but
Actually,
yeah.
Jessica, are you comfortable with talking about, because I think we alluded to this before, but how has your time in academia and studying anthropology helped you reflect on your own personal life experiences, especially with grief?
Yeah. So for me, I think when I was growing up, I didn't really think about I thought about my identity, but not on such a deep level that I do now, that I have these kind of these theoretical tools that I can use to kind of think about identity formation and think about my own positionality within the world. Because a lot of the kind of positive aspects of anthropology, it's about thinking about your positionality as a researcher, and how that relates to kind of the social constructs that you're studying. And it's grad school has been complicated. My mom passed away my first semester of graduate school. She was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer during my junior year of college, I believe. And she was always the kind of person who's like, you do good in school, I'm not gonna distract you from that. Like, literally, when she was diagnosed, she didn't tell me for like 3 months. I had gone to school, I came home for Thanksgiving, expected her to pick me up from the airport. My 2 aunties came to pick me up. And when I got home, I saw her sitting there with an oxygen machine. And I was so, like, I didn't know how to react. I was mad, I was upset. And, you know, and when I started graduate school, like, thankfully she was able to come to my college graduation. We had time together. But when I went to graduate school, like, she didn't really want to tell me what was going on back home. I went to 1 radiation treatment with her before I packed up and left for Arizona. And then, you know, my mom's like, oh, how are you doing in school? I don't want to distract you. Like, we'd call every once in a while, but she'd never want to tell me how she was doing because she just wanted me to do good in school. I'm like, Mom, there are things that are more important than like school. And like, any good educator, any good college professor, if you have a parent that's dying, they're gonna let you leave class. And if you have a professor that doesn't let you do that, then that's a problem. That's their problem. That's not yours. And anyway, like, even when she was in the hospital right before she died, my aunties and uncles didn't want to tell me what was going on because she told them that she didn't want to distract me from school. And it wasn't until my uncle had sent me a text message being like, hey, you should get a flight home this weekend. Like, and it was like the middle of the week and I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what was going on. Nobody would tell me what was going on. And I understand, like, culture, they didn't want to talk about it. My mom had told them not to talk to me about it. They wanted to respect their wishes. I don't blame them for that at all. I understand. But my roommate at the time was with me. She was in her office and I just like ran over there and she called the hospital and figured out what was going on. And like, I talked to my advisor and they're like, go, go, go. Like, you can be gone for 2 weeks. We'll like figure out your schedule, whatever. And it was just kind of this clash of mentalities. Like there was this idea of like, oh, the school is the most important thing you're doing right now. And where's my advisor? And like, you know, the graduate advisor were like, no, go, we'll figure it out later. Do what you need to do. And I am so glad I was able to be there. Like, I was able to hold her hand right till the end. But it felt so surreal. It felt so surreal. As like in my research, I look at death and dying all the time. I look at mortuary practices. But like experiencing it was the first time I'd been there for someone who died. It was the first time I'd attended a funeral. And like, I felt like more like a participant observer than anything. So both a participant in that it was my mom and like I was there grieving for her. but also just kind of the practice around it was very alien to me. A lot of my mom's side of the family is very religious. I grew up Catholic. I don't go to church anymore for various reasons, but for them, it's like very important culturally. That's how they raise. It's part of their connection to the Philippines. And so like I was sitting there and like everybody's praying the rosary and I'm like trying to process my own grief. And looking back on it now, and like, you know, I look at kind of grief and mourning in the archaeological context too, and thinking about this kind of contrast between this social mourning, so like the process of the funeral, all of the kind of ritual around it that people use to process that grief, and then the personal grief. And it's, yeah, and that kind of personal grief gets torn between like your own identity and your own kind of concepts of how to process it and kind of the cultural norms that you're surrounded by. It's like my mom said, like everyone that was at the funeral, it's like they knew what they were doing. I mean, they experienced, my grandparents died before I was born. And so like, it's like they all knew what they're doing. They'd seen this before, they were going through the motions, and like, obviously everybody was grieving in their own way. But for me, it was this surreal kind of out of body experience. And so, yeah, it's kind of for me, it was a very kind of like complicated relationship between my own identity and like my mom's side of the family. They all immigrated from the Philippines in the late 70s. Whereas me and my cousins, we all grew up in the United States our entire lives. And so it's kind of this tension between my experience growing up in America, my experience with, you know, my kind of tangential experience with death, but not actually experiencing it firsthand. And then navigating those cultural norms and being respectful of what my family needed to process that grief, and kind of figuring out what I needed at the same time. So yeah, it was just it's kind of navigating those identities and dealing with grief has been, it's been complicated, I guess. And it was interesting at the same time. So like on the kind of the religious aspect, my mom, she didn't want a funeral mass. She just wanted a blessing at the grave. But I remember at the funeral, like people being like, oh, I contacted the priest and they're going to dedicate such and such mass to your mom. And I'm like, okay, like if that's part of what you need to mourn her, that's good. And it was kind of this weird tension. But yeah, I don't know. It's this kind of intersection of identities making it even more complicated. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what else to say on that, but
Gosh, thank you for sharing, Jessica.
yeah.
Yeah, just hearts all around, especially from the chat for you. And like we actually, I actually also know Jessica growing up in our childhood. So I do remember seeing her and her mom at our church growing up, and I think we fell out of contact during the time that your mom was in the hospital. So I didn't know until I saw it on Facebook, and it was also just weird coming home and not seeing her when I was visiting with my folks at church. Thank you for sharing that. Well, this part of what Reimagine does, actually, like the core of what Reimagine does is create these spaces so that we can talk about grief, so that we can talk about things that make us like really reflect on ways that we have grieved throughout our lives. And did anyone else have any stories from their own lives about grief that they've experienced and how their identities may have factored into it, may have not factored into it at all, but just how everyone grieves throughout their lives, like it's affected by our entire life story. If anyone has anything to share, then this is a perfect space for it because we're all here together in this room. And I'm reading through the chat. Thank you all for sharing your stories and your support. Uh, so Crystal, Aisha, or Sarah, if you have anything to add, otherwise I can bring in a question from the audience that we've had.
I'd love to share a little bit about how I'm reflecting on my experience with grief. It actually through like there's tons of parallels between the grief, my grief process, and then also how I've experienced a lot of the hardships of about being mixed race itself. It was kind of illuminating for me. So when I was 11, I basically, in a nutshell, I got a death diagnosis from a group of neurosurgeons and neurologists in Madison. They were doing like a follow-up CAT scan after a brain surgery and found this mass in a very deep part of my brain. And they basically pulled my parents into the doctor's room, and I was outside in the lobby, and for like hours. And I knew something was up. And basically they described the situation in that like it was in such a deep part of my brain that if they were to operate, they would kill me. And if they were to do chemotherapy, I would basically just not be functional for the rest of my life. And so which one do you want? Which option? They were saying to my parents. And at that point, and then they said, you must make a decision. My parents were like, well, we just want to have her live as best of a life as she can. And they said, no, you need to make a decision. This was in the 80s, so medical ethics too in the 80s. And then they said, but it just so happens that tomorrow a world-renowned neurosurgeon just so happens to be stopping in. And because he's so amazing, he can look at everything, and he will have the final say if you're interested. And we're like, of course we're interested, right? So at that point, my parents booked a hotel room, and I was still confused. And it was there in the hotel room that my parents basically told me I was going to die. There's this small chance about this doctor coming the next day, and I wrote my goodbye letter to my best friend at the time. And we had the worst. We went out for Red Lobster, and we had very modest means, and so like that was like the big splurge it's ever like, and it was the worst Red Lobster dinner you could ever possibly like. It tasted just so terrible, right? And the next day, the doctor came back and said, when we met with him, he said, look, there is something there. We know it. However, let's just wait and just monitor the status, because we're going to kill this child one way or another if we do anything. And he saved my life. And so, but all throughout, like I had to have CAT scans and MRIs. Like first it was weekly, and then bi-weekly, and then monthly, and then bi-monthly, and then quarterly, and then, just like for 10 years. So I have so much radiation in me, like I can't even tell you. But it was just like, at any moment, he said, we need to proceed with like, because the doctors wanted to do chemo like the very next day, right? And so like, but this specialist, he said, like, so I've always had my mortality has always been in front of me, always. And so when I was in 5th grade, of course, like the girls are thinking about like who they have crushes on, and I'm thinking about like, oh, I have my scan tomorrow, I hope I'm going to live, that kind of a thing. And that followed me for 10 years when they stopped finally monitoring. But it still proceeds even just today. I mean, like if anything happens, and the list of like the warning triggers of of symptoms, and everything could be over, like game over, right? And I found out much later that in a neighboring town, the same thing happened in the same time frame, where a girl, there was a brain tumor, and the doctors wanted to operate, and the parents said no. And this was like within 6 months of what happened to me in a neighboring town. And the doctors took the parents to court for negligence because the parents did not want to do anything. And the doctors won. They proceeded with with their thing, and they killed the girl. So that was the era, right? That was the era of medical ethics and everything. And so like there was just like this thin line of survival for, I'm just like, wow. And so, but even now I know like, and actually that's fueled a lot of my activism is like, dude, like life could end tomorrow, dude. You know, like, do you understand that? Like, I don't want to watch movies. I want to do stuff. I want to do stuff, you know, like there's no time to waste. So definitely some survivor's guilt in some of this, right? But also, I think as I've been reflecting on it, I think like this type of liminal health status, right? Also mirrors a lot of like my journey with being mixed race itself. So like, first of all, like being in a liminal space, right? Am I healthy? Am I almost dead? You know, like the switch could happen. What am I actually health-wise? And of course, what am I racially? So that's one thing. Another thing is precariousness. You know, obviously, like with this quasi death sentence, you could be dead at any time, at any one scan, like game over. But there's so much precariousness in being mixed race for me in terms of belonging. In any moment, in any group, they could kick me out because I'm not, as Jessica was saying, I'm not enough. Right. So there's this precarious sense of like trying to earn the belonging. Will the giving of belonging, the withholding of belonging, you know, like you're not enough. Your skin isn't dark enough. Your nose isn't, you know, whatever it is, your hair is too curly, la, 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 la. You know, so there's this precariousness of belonging. And then there's also like this unshared inner reality. You know, when I was a kid, you know, so growing up, like I had my mortality always in front of me, and like they didn't understand what it was. There was this unshared inner reality of what was going on inside. As I'm walking through, and I'm still like, you know, the girl, la, 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 in class, but you know, inside there's this awareness of like, I'm different, number one, and obviously being mixed, you know, existentially, biologically, I don't share your reality externally, but also this internal, like an unshared inner reality of isolation, of genetic isolation, especially I'm speaking as a biracial, you know, so like monoracial, biracial, like genetic isolation, and also not having a language to speak. Because again, like this field is so new, but it's like sometimes like when you grieve, you don't have the words, right? You fumble around and you're like, I can't even explain what I'm feeling. Same thing for me with being mixed. Like there's a lack of language around being mixed. Like, what is it when I'm light skinned, and do I belong? Do I not? What is the word? There's no word right now. You know, I'm highlighted. There is a lack of a word, and they have like white adjacent, and that's not a good word. Like we're fumbling around for these words, and we don't have the words. And I feel like that same thing with that. And then also finally, like this concept of silencing. You know, as Jessica was saying, like we don't talk about it, you know, for grieving. But it's the same thing with being mixed. Don't talk about your feelings about being, don't talk about, I don't want to know your questions. Like there's this sense of like these questions, like this inner reality doesn't belong anywhere in this world of boxes. And so like we silence ourselves, or our parents silence us, or our loved ones or our friends silence us. And so you know, and so I think like there's just this topic of grieving. I think maybe there's almost like this inherent, like we must, like this, as Jessica was speaking, I had this aha moment of like grief, like as mixed race people, we really like in part of our healing, I think as part of our, like, we need to claim the fact that we need to grieve the fact, you know, it's just the different types of losses, the different types of erasings, the different even within from our own parents and from within ourselves and within everything. Like there's so much grieving just in being mixed. And of course, you know, there's a lot of different ways that all different types of groups also need to do grieving for their own health. But I think also like the type of grieving for the mixed race healing of just mixed race grieving is just like there's a lot of nuanced losses that I think get glossed over in like the big tsunamis of news headlines and everything. And I think that could very well be an important part of at least my healing, is really like owning the grief because there's a lot of great stuff in being mixed, and not, no joke, but to be true to myself, I need to really honor the fact that there's a lot of deep losses as well. So it's just really interesting that like my having my medical history and like my mixed race journey are actually very parallel to each other, and I just kind of wanted to voice that if anybody
Thank you
found
for
that helpful.
Gosh, yeah, that's a pretty incredible that you had to write a farewell letter when you were 11. But that's a ton of weight to grow up with and to deal with from a young age. But thank you so much for sharing that, and how that's kind of led to your activism and the amazing personality that we have here today. Aisha or Sarah, do you want to share any stories about it? It doesn't have to be necessarily a loss that you had in your life, but how has grief appeared in your life, and how have you come to terms with addressing it or living with it?
Happy to jump in, or open to jumping in. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
more fitting term. I think, gosh, there are so many layers to this. I'm trying to think about how to kind of bring it together. But I think one part, when I was preparing for this conversation, or just kind of meditating on this conversation to come, I was thinking about the passing of my grandmother long ago, or relatively more than a decade ago, when I was still kind of in secondary school. And she was a very important figure, not only for me, but for my family, kind of this, the glue that keeps everything together and keeps peace, and also, encourages open-mindedness. Like I think about so many of the things that she passed on to us. Like my mother is African American and she speaks Mandarin, and she spent a lot of her summers in Taiwan, even though our family was working class and like had all these, all these layers that my grandma, part of the abundance of her spirit, sowed those seeds, and probably were passed on from folks that I don't know, or histories that have been erased or hidden. And so on one level, I think it's both difficult and really powerful to think about how our histories can play a role in how we understand transition and death and dying and living fully, however we might mean that. And I think a lot about, my mom is also like super open to talk about transition, to talk about death, and I grew up in a Buddhist household as well, in addition to all the other faiths that are in my family. So very much, talking about transition through the Buddhist philosophy, which I'm not going to even try to summarize here, but I think in some ways she kind of forced me to have conversation, and still today forces me to have conversations about this on a regular basis, in a way that I think has been really powerful for me to also think about death and dying as that there are many different kinds of transitions. Perhaps for some, a new year is the old year is passing. There's a renewal. There's a burning of incense or other things that maybe arise in, for example, some Japanese funereal traditions. In African American traditions, although I don't want to try to summarize any of these things, but you think about homegoing, and it kind of, for me, it makes me very sad to also think about that feeling of being liberated finally from all the weight of the histories, if you will. And so I think a lot about, I try to bring the concept of transition and death into kind of daily life, and to help destigmatize it, to help unpack it by thinking about the ways in which it's also a transformation. And I like to think about that kind of like, no energy is created or destroyed, it only just transforms. And so I think about that in terms of my loved ones who have passed, whether that's my grandmother's spirit and energy, or I think about that in terms of even the art that it forces you to kind of rework things. I've been thinking a lot about, during this pandemic, garden metaphors, although I could use some gardening lessons, so anyone out there. but I think a lot about how, I had a house plant that was slowly just like it was not doing well, right? And I talked to a friend who was really great with house plants, and they said, well, how's the soil? And it's very hard. They're like, you gotta poke some holes into it, otherwise it can't absorb the nutrients, it can't absorb the water. And sometimes it feels like the the tension around that conversation can prevent us from holding the nutrients, holding some of the waters, holding some of the nourishment, and also allowing things to flow through that are no longer serving us. So I think about things like that. I think about composting, like the power of composting, all the someone alluded to the cortisol levels, how the racialized impacts of our lived experience, how that can flow through. My grandma would always say, hate poisons the soul. So how can I compost some of that everyday feeling? I also think about the context of passing and dying in different, like whether it's by age or chronic illnesses, or the list can go on, and or by police brutality, or all these different formations that I have. That's all part of the kind of knitting stuff that I'm working through, and I try to think about those garden metaphors, think about creativity as a force to gain proximity and some sort of fluency in being able to talk about it and being able to connect, and hopefully without the same kind of fear that sometimes shuts us off from one another. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Aisha. So it's actually the time where we like to take audience questions. And I'm going to start with the ones that have been in the chat, especially the ones that people have been adding on to. But I'm going to direct this first one to Sarah because I know she has a brother. If any of you have siblings, have you had conversations about these topics or themes? And if you have or haven't, just why or why not, and how did it go? Yeah, Sarah, how'd it go?
Yeah. They're pretty short most of the time. My brother and I are fairly opposite. I think he would not be offended if I said that. We just think very differently. And like the one thing that I can use to describe, like, I guess how a lot of people would see me is like in Mandarin, we'd say like, 你想太多, like you think way too much about it. And I feel like that's his attitude when I think about identity and being mixed. He's like, you think way too much about this. Like, I'm over here doing my thing and you're over here doing yours. And so I find like talking explicitly about being mixed is like just not helpful. Like but actually like connecting and like naming specific experiences we have had and like not attaching like, I guess like very analytical language to it actually produces more fruit in the conversation. Yeah, like it's kind of funny. I guess it's like I can't expect, like someone can't expect me to like know perfect Cantonese, right? Like I didn't grow up with it. Like we didn't grow up with like this language of like knowing what it is to like be mixed. Like I think we're the only people in like either side of my family who is. I only like really started to delve into my identity and what that meant for me, like in college. And of course, it's going to be a super different experience than his. We went to different schools. We have different personalities. And in the end, like, I don't think it really matters if he knows the specific term or not, or like if he can like names like these really, like the same exact feelings that I can. But I think we both can relate to like, it's uncomfortable. Like it can be so uncomfortable to be in like a family space and to like be struggling with like chopsticks when you're like way too old, to like be just starting to learn, or like to like attend either side of a family reunion and feel like we have so many different thoughts and feelings than what our families think or feel and how they interact. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say about my brother. Yeah, I actually like asked him some questions for this panel and he didn't have a lot to say actually, but he was supportive and I think that's cool. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, didn't mean to put you on the spot with there, but you're the one person that I know has a sibling. So.
Yeah, that's okay.
Did anyone else on the panel want to answer that question as well? Like, have you had an opportunity to talk to family members or siblings, especially about the experiences of being multiracial?
I would just like to name two. I think talking to parents is a completely different ballgame than talking to siblings.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if we wanted to talk about parents and whether or not they even acknowledge your mixed identity, I think that's a whole nother can of worms.
For sure. Well, Liz actually has been compiling all the questions that have been asked in the chat. Liz, you want to go ahead and pose
Yeah.
one of the questions?
Thank you so much, everyone, for putting your questions in the chat. I will just start with the order that it came in. There is a question about geographically, do you feel a person of the world or feel geographically in one place? I think that's for all the speakers. And it seems like maybe some of you have already addressed it, but if there's anything that you would want to add in particular. And as you think about that, I am also able to move on to the next question. How do you hold all the ancestors in your lineage? These are some very thoughtful questions.
Feel welcome to think out loud.
I hold them. This is how I hold my ancestors. I hold them like this, like this.
All of them.
Embodied answer. That's my embodied answer. It's been really interesting with ancestors and ancestry because obviously that's such a huge thing right now. It's always been big, but our eyes have not always been open to know that. My Chinese dad withheld basically all of his ancestry. He's one of the types of immigrants where like you start over and you erase everything. My mom's side was my white side. My grandmother got Alzheimer's, and my like very little on either side, And in some ways, it just felt so dislocating. Like where am I even located? And I think that's one of the reasons why I find so much home in like earth, right, and earth practices. But ancestors. It was really, so like I've always been like, what do I do with this? Like I don't even know my ancestors. What is this? And I was in fact, one of Oceana Sawyer is here. She was leading one of the ancestry workshops, and I had this like moment of insight in one of these meditations, and it was like the ancestors, even because it's like, how do I heal the fact that I don't know them and I never will? I will never, ever, like other side of the world, never know them. And so again, more grief, right? But also like, how do I bridge that just like within myself? How do I not feel so like isolated on so many levels? And like, I had this meditation, it's like, boom, like this image, this vision, this whatever you want to call it, it was great. And it was like, the ancestors are the roots, right? Obviously. And I am a leaf. And if you look at a tree, will the leaf ever see the roots? No, it's a leaf. It's outside. It sees the sun. It sees the wind. It sees the birds, whatever. But what is feeding it is the roots, right? It is unseen. The unseen is always there and is always sustaining. I'm sorry, what?
There's so many good metaphors in this event.
Yes, that's beautiful.
And so that's kind of how I've come to a sense of healing about ancestry and how do I hold my ancestors? Well, actually, my ancestors hold me, right? That's my answer. And just the like, but by like, and even though I will never know them, it's as intrinsic of like, just as the roots feed the leaf, my ancestors feed me, even though the leaf will never see the roots. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I love that so much. And I think as someone who I always thought I didn't look like either side of my family. I still don't really think that I look like my parents. But finally, my dad or my mom, for like after the 10th time, I told her, like, I don't look like, either of you. Am I adopted? I know I'm not, but am I? Like, she was like, we actually think that you look a lot like your dad's sister. My, yeah, like my auntie, who passed away a couple years ago, and it's just like, oh my gosh, I not only can I see it, but like I just see so much of her like within myself, and I I just think that's so powerful that like our ancestors do like hold us up, and that they're imbued so much more in us than like we'll ever even know. But actually, like we don't need to do anything, like, I mean, of course, like I think like we can honor them and like how we live our lives. But at the same time, we don't need to like, I guess, like unlock something like deep inside of us, or like feel like access something, like it's already just in like us being alive and in existing, like we're already doing that. So yeah, I just find that really encouraging, Crystal, so thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, like with 5 minutes left of this event, there's
I
never
know,
enough
so
time
many
for
questions.
questions, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. With that, before I turn it back to Andy, which I'm sure he's going to cover, we just want people to know that we do have a T-Chat event next week, same time, and for this exact opportunity for the conversation to continue. So we invite everyone who's on here who wants to continue this conversation to join us next week, and it will be more an opportunity for us to hear from the audience, to see, to hear and give you a week to process things that have come up for you or questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Holly. Wow, this was just amazing to have such brilliant minds in one space. I want to share with you at some point soon this poll that we have, which I will do. Let me pull it up. And what's going to be interesting for me is sort of remarking what Aisha said about the problematics of some of these terms, like biracial. You'll see that term come up in this poll. So I want you to email me at andy@letsreimagine.org and tell me what you thought of these questions, because Table Talk is still a work in progress, and I'm happy to take your feedback on this. So I'm just going to let this run, and then I want to share my slides. Hold on one second. Let's see. Here we go. Yes. Also, I just wanted to give you feedback on some of these amazing nuggets of knowledge that came from this. Jessica, quote, "Although race is a social construct, it has a biological impact on people." That was quite powerful. Also, I appreciated, Crystal, this notion of the precariousness of belonging. So we have these other table talks coming up that I'm responsible for. Pride Month, we have our LGBTQ+ focused sub-series of Table Talk, May 25th, a conversation about solo aging for LGBTQ+ elders and these amazing housing initiatives. We've got a program on spirituality, grief, and the Puerto Rican experience on June 1st. And then on June 8th, Ballroom Has Something to Say, where we showcase the beautiful house ballroom community. This is Holly and Elizabeth's last talk for now with the AAPI series. I just want to congratulate both of you for leading this effort. You've done a wonderful job on this, so thank you. What else do I have to say here? Yes.
Well, I also just want to invite the speakers. Some of them have done this already, but if we have any events coming up, or if you have any social media that you'd like to promote, please put it in the chat so that the audience members can keep following you after this talk.
I think that's it for now.
Yeah.
So thank you all. And we hope to see you at more table talks in the future.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I
Thank
know
you.
this wasn't nearly enough time as we needed to answer all the questions and to have the conversation that we really could have. But that's what next week's T-Chat is for, if you can make it. So please join us. And yeah, sorry, there isn't a link ready for it yet. We haven't put it up. But we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to register. So thank you again to Aisha, Crystal, Jessica, and Sarah for being our guests today. And we're so glad to have you at the table. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.